Good morning and welcome to Mission Control Houston. I'm Anna Schneider with NASA Communications, and you are currently seeing a live look of the Dragon spacecraft for NASA's SpaceX 33rd Commercial Resupply Services mission, which is expected to undock in just about 20 minutes from now at 11:05 a.m. Central, 12:05 p.m. Eastern. The resupply mission launched on Sunday, August 24th on a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket from Space Launch Complex 40 at the Cape Canaveral Space Force Station in Florida. The mission delivered new scientific experiments and cargo to the International Space Station when it docked on Monday, August 25th to the forward port of the space station's Harmony module, which has now been its home for the past 6 months. During its time docked to the orbiting laboratory, the Dragon spacecraft introduced a new capability to reboost the space station, helping maintain its altitude and counter atmospheric drag, which is critical for safe operations and the long-term sustainability of the orbital complex. Dragon performed 6 total reboosts, 5 in 2025, and then a final maneuver in January before preparations for its departure began. Following today's undocking and departure, the Dragon spacecraft is scheduled to splash down off the coast of California around 11:44 p.m. Pacific later today, 1:44 a.m. Central, Friday, February 27th. Coming up in about 5 minutes at around 10:50 a.m. Central, 11:50 a.m. Eastern, we are expecting the final go, no-go poll for undocking, and this poll confirms that the NASA team here in Mission Control Houston, which you're seeing a live view there on your screen, along with the SpaceX team in Hawthorne, California, are ready to proceed with Dragon's departure. Currently on console here in the International Space Station Flight Control Room is the Orbit 2 team of flight controllers being led by Flight Director Chloe Maring there on the left side of your screen, whose call sign is Lion Flight, and to her right is the Capcom or capsule communicator Costa Mavridis. The Capcom serves as the voice link between Mission Control and the space station crew. Mission Control Houston operates 24/7, 365 days a year with 3 shifts per day known as orbits. Along with the team here in Houston, they are working hand in hand with the SpaceX Mission Control team out in Hawthorne, California, who is also on console supporting today's undocking operations. The SpaceX team out there, which you can see live on your screen, is led by their mission director, commonly referred to as the MD. After the Dragon spacecraft crosses the approach ellipsoid, which is an invisible boundary around the space station that governs visiting spacecraft, joint operations between the NASA and SpaceX teams will end, and responsibility for the spacecraft will be handed back to the SpaceX team. Again, you're seeing a live look of the Dragon spacecraft attached to the Harmony module on the International Space Station as it prepares for today's undocking. We're expecting that final go, no-go poll in about a minute, and that undocking is scheduled at 11:05 a.m. Central, 12:05 p.m. Eastern today. Now, currently on board the International Space Station is the Expedition 74 crew. They are led by the current space station commander, Sergei Kudzvirshkov of Roscosmos, and you can see a picture of all of the Expedition 74 crew members on your screen. And less than 2 weeks ago, Crew 12, which includes NASA astronauts Jessica Meir and Jack Hathaway, ESA or European Space Agency astronaut Sophie Adenau, and Roscosmos cosmonaut Andrei Fedyaev, launched and docked to the orbiting laboratory and joined Expedition 74. Also on board are NASA astronaut Chris Williams and Roscosmos cosmonaut Sergei Mikhaev. And we did just hear moments ago that the SpaceX and NASA teams have pulled go for today's undocking, so we are good to proceed with the undocking in just about 15 minutes from now.
Dragon is go for undocking and departure. We are 10 minutes away from the command for undock. You have 10 minutes.
And you just heard the call up to the space station crew by the Capcom or capsule communicator Costa Mavridis to the space station crew, confirming the undocking in about 15 minutes. The undock command will be sent about 5 minutes ahead of the physical separation Once the undock command is sent, the umbilicals that are attached to the space station, along with the hooks that are keeping Dragon hard mated to the space station, will retract to allow that physical separation to take place. The space station crew that's currently on board Expedition 74, it began in December following the departure of the Soyuz MS-27 spacecraft and will continue through July of this year. After the Soyuz MS-28 spacecraft departs the station in July, carrying NASA astronauts Chris Williams and his Roscosmos crewmates back to Earth, Expedition 75 will officially commence, led by NASA astronaut Jessica Meir. The current space station commander, Sergei Kudzvirshkov of Roscosmos, will hand over command of the space station shortly before the Soyuz MS-28 departure during a standard change of command ceremony. In preparation for today's undocking, the Expedition 74 crew has been packing the Dragon spacecraft with cargo for return to Earth. Several scientific investigations are returning aboard Dragon, offering insights that could help shape the future of space exploration and life on Earth. One of the experiments returning today is a study known as Euro material aging, which exposed 141 samples to space for a year to examine how coatings, insulation, and 3D printed materials degrade. The preparations for today's undocking have been taking place over the past few days and weeks as cargo has been packed into the Dragon spacecraft return, and then just today, about a couple of hours ago, around 9 a.m. Central, 10 a.m. Eastern, the hatches between the space station and Dragon were sealed. On board space station, NASA astronaut Chris Williams helped work through those procedures to close the hatches. Following hatch closure, the process to depressurize the vestibule began, along with leak checks, and the vestibule is the area between the Dragon and space station hatches that is exposed to the vacuum of space prior to the docking of a visiting spacecraft. Once a spacecraft docks, the area is pressurized to match the pressure aboard the space station, which is about 14.7 psi, or pounds per square inch, which is equivalent to Earth's atmospheric pressure. Again, you're seeing a live look of the Dragon spacecraft that we are expecting to undock in about 13 minutes from now at 11:05 a.m. Central, 12:05 p.m. Eastern. Physical separation of the Dragon spacecraft from the forward port of the station's Harmony module is set again for about 12 minutes from now, and just like its approach to the space station, Dragon's departure in deorbit is fully autonomous. Departure is typically quicker than arrival, as the spacecraft doesn't have to stop at any waypoints like we see when a spacecraft arrives. The undocking command will be sent about 5 minutes prior to physical separation. At that point, the umbilicals will retract. These umbilicals connect Dragon systems to the space station, transferring power, telemetry, and commands between the two spacecrafts during Dragon's stay. After the umbilicals retract, the hooks that are currently keeping Dragon attached to the space station will unlatch. There are 2 sets of 6 hooks for a total of 12 hooks. Once that process is complete, Dragon will then be ready to depart from the space station and will begin to move itself further away using its thrusters. Dragon will first execute 2 short thruster firings to undock using a combination of the 12 Draco thrusters around the base of the spacecraft. The first firing will break any stiction between Dragon and the docking port, and then the second firing will slowly back the spacecraft away, and we will have that physical separation. Following physical separation, again planned for 11:05 a.m. Central, 12:05 p.m. Eastern, Dragon will then use its Draco thrusters again to move away from the station in a series of 4 departure burns. These departure burns are carefully choreographed maneuvers that increase the distance between the spacecraft and the space station. Shortly after Dragon completes departure burn 1, Dragon will exit the keep-out sphere. The keep-out sphere is a 200-meter invisible boundary around the space station, and it is one of several safety zones set up to govern visiting spacecraft either arriving or departing the space station.
Station Houston, we are 5 minutes away from undock. Please pause exercise.
And you just heard that call up from
Station copy.
And you just heard that call up from the Capcom or capsule communicator here in Mission Control to the space station crew aboard the International Space Station that we are about 5 minutes away from that undocking command to begin. And they mentioned that they will pause any exercise going on, and that is to avoid imparting any additional loads during the active operations. Now, before the spacecraft moves into the keep out sphere, they have to be configured to where they would not cross the imaginary boundary for at least 4 orbits, even if the spacecraft lost all maneuvering. And then after Dragon departs the keep out sphere, the next milestone is exiting the approach ellipsoid. The approach ellipsoid is another imaginary shape similar to the keep out sphere, but this time it's a 3-dimensional ellipsoid measuring 4 by 2 by 2 kilometers. One of the key differences with the approach ellipsoid is that spacecraft outside of it have to be on what we call a 24-hour safe free drift trajectory. That means the spacecraft would not cross into the approach ellipsoid for at least 24 hours again, even if it lost all maneuvering. After Dragon exits the approach ellipsoid, joint operations between the NASA and SpaceX teams will conclude, and Dragon will be well on its way back to Earth, again with splashdown expected off the coast of California around 11:44 p.m. Pacific later today, 1:44 a.m. Central Friday, February 27th. Again, we are about 4 minutes away from that undocking command. Once that undocking command is sent, it'll be about 5 minutes before we have confirmation of physical separation. And we are about 3 minutes away from that undocking command being sent, and that will kick off a sequence of events that will then lead to the physical separation of the Dragon spacecraft for the NASA SpaceX 33rd Commercial Resupply Services mission. The Dragon spacecraft was packed with cargo over the past few weeks, and some of those include scientific investigations that will be returning to Earth. One of those is the Space Dwino project, which is paving the way for more low-cost instruments after successfully measuring vibrations using commercially available single-board computer and open-source software. And another one of the experiments returning is known as the Moon Microscope, which also successfully tested a portable diagnostic kit for blood analysis in space that could support future missions to the Moon and Mars. Again, we are about 2 minutes away from the undocking command being sent. Once the undocking command is sent, the first step will be for the umbilicals to retract. After that, the 12 hooks that are currently keeping Dragon attached to the space station will start to unlatch in 2 sets of 6. And then after that, there will be 2 short thruster firings known as undock burns to physically separate Dragon from the International Space Station and set it on its course back to Earth. We are now about 30 seconds away from that undock command being sent. Currently, the International Space Station and Dragon are flying about 260 statute miles off the coast of Chile. And on your screen, you're continuing to see a live view of that Dragon spacecraft, again attached to the forward port of the space station's Harmony module, which has been its home for the last 6 months since its launch last August. And the undock sequence has begun with that undock command being sent. Again, the departure process is completely autonomous, so now that this undock command has been sent, the umbilicals will retract. Those umbilicals were attached following the docking of the Dragon spacecraft back in August, and they help provide data and telemetry between the space station to the Dragon spacecraft. And we have confirmation that those umbilicals have demated. Next up will be the retraction of the 12 hooks that are currently attaching Dragon to the International Space Station. Again, those hooks will drive in 2 sets of 6, and that first set of hooks are currently driving. And this is Mission Control Houston. It's been about 2 minutes since that undock command was sent. Again, the entire undock sequence takes about 5 minutes from the command being sent to the physical separation taking place. So we are about 3 minutes away from that physical separation, and the hooks are currently unlatching. Once all 12 hooks have unlatched, there will be 2 short thruster firings that will help break any stiction and then push Dragon initially away from the International Space Station, marking that physical separation and the end of its resupply mission to the International Space Station. And the first set of hooks are now open, and the second set of 6 hooks are now driving open. So we are now committed to undocking.
Hooks open. Dragon is committed to undock.
The second set of hooks are continuing to drive open, and we are about a minute away from that expected physical separation. We have a brief loss of signal, or LOS, and that is due to a change in the ground station's the tracking and data relay satellite system, or TDRS, that provides the communications between the International Space Station and Dragon, but we should have those views back shortly. And we have confirmation that the Dragon spacecraft has undocked from the International Space Station at 11:05 a.m. Central, 12:05 p.m. Eastern, as the space station was traveling 260 statute miles over western Argentina. Again, this marks the completion. Again, this marks the...
Station Houston, all hooks open. Dragon separation is confirmed.
And you heard that call up there from the Capcom or capsule communicator who is here in Mission Control Houston. Again, they serve as the voice link between the crew and the ground. And again, with that undocking confirmed at 11:05 a.m. Central, 12:05 p.m. Eastern, as the space station was traveling 260 statute miles over western Argentina. Again, this marks the completion of NASA's SpaceX 33rd Commercial Resupply Services mission to the space station.
Station Houston, Dragon departure burn 0 complete.
And there you now have a live look of the Dragon spacecraft as it continues to back away from the International Space Station. And we do have confirmation that that first departure burn was completed. That was a 17-second burn and the first of 4 departure burns, which helped to move Dragon further away from the International Space Station. The next burn will be in about 4 minutes, around 11:10 a.m. Central, 12:10 p.m. Eastern, and that is departure burn 1. That burn will last about 24 seconds, and it will help move the spacecraft beyond the keep-out sphere. And we're going through another brief loss of signal, or LOS, as the ground stations transition out as part of the tracking and data relay satellite system known as TDRS. The departure of Dragon continues to proceed as planned. The spacecraft is about 40 meters away from the International Space Station now, and again, it'll exit the keep-out sphere, which is the first invisible boundary around the space station that governs arriving and departing spacecraft once it hits that 200-meter mark. And for those of you who may just be joining us, about 3 minutes ago at 11:05 a.m. Central, 12:05 p.m. Eastern, the Dragon spacecraft supporting NASA's SpaceX 33rd Commercial Resupply Services mission to the International Space Station successfully undocked from the forward port of the station's Harmony module, completing an approximately 6-month mission where it spent its time docked, delivering science and cargo to the space station crew. It also performed a series of reboosts, 6 in total, with the last one being in January, and now we have those live views back. And you can see Dragon there in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen as it continues to back away from the International Space Station, again with that physical separation taking place about 4 minutes ago. Dragon is now about 75 meters away from the International Space Station and continuing to increase that distance. The next departure burn will take place in about a minute and a half. It'll be a 24-second thruster firing, and that will help push the spacecraft beyond the keep-out sphere, which is that 200-meter invisible boundary around the space station. And we're now about 1 minute away from that second departure burn, known as Depart Burn 1. The first departure burn is known as Depart Burn 0, and that took place about 30 seconds after the physical separation, and it was a 17-second burn, and that burn was executed as planned and helped to push Dragon further away from the International Space Station after its physical separation and first two thruster firings, which are known as Undock Burn 1 and 2. Dragon is now about 130 meters away from the International Space Station, so about 70 meters away from crossing the Keep Out Sphere. Again, the Keep Out Sphere is that first invisible boundary that the spacecraft will cross on its departure today. The second boundary being the Approach Ellipsoid, or the AE. The AE is further out and it measures 2 by 2 by 4 kilometers around the International Space Station. And they are both invisible boundaries that govern arriving and departing spacecraft.
Station Houston, departure burn 1 complete.
And we have confirmation there that the departure burn 1 is complete, so we are now just standing by for confirmation that Dragon has exited the Keep Out Sphere. And Dragon has now officially exited the Keep Out Sphere. It's about 230 meters away from the International Space Station. Again, the Keep Out Sphere is an invisible 200-meter line centered on the space station that is monitored by flight controllers to govern physical.
Station Houston, Dragon has exited the Keep Out Sphere.
And there you heard that call up from the Capcom, or Capsule Communicator Costa Mavridis here in Mission Control Houston, that Dragon has exited the Keep Out Sphere. Again, the Keep Out Sphere is that invisible 200-meter line centered on the space station that is monitored by flight controllers to govern spacecraft that are approaching and departing the International Space Station. The next milestone that we are looking forward to on Dragon's departure today will take place in about 12 minutes. And that is when it will exit the approach ellipsoid. We're expecting that exit to take place around 11:24 a.m. Central, 12:24 p.m. Eastern. The approach ellipsoid is another imaginary shape, this time a three-dimensional ellipsoid measuring 4 by 2 by 2 kilometers in the same family as the Keep Out Sphere. After the spacecraft crosses the approach ellipsoid, joint operations will end and we'll wrap our coverage, and then responsibility for the spacecraft is also handed back to the SpaceX flight control team in Hawthorne, California. After Dragon exits the approach ellipsoid, there are still several milestones that the spacecraft has to go through in preparation for its deorbit and splashdown early tomorrow morning. Again, that splashdown expected around 1:44 a.m. Central tomorrow morning, which is 11:44 p.m. Pacific time off the coast of California. After the approach ellipsoid exit, there will be 2 more departure burns in that series of 4 departure burns. And there will also be a departure phase burn before they get into the rapid sequence of re-entry operations, with the deorbit burn planned for early tomorrow morning on Central Time, so 12:52 a.m. Central, 10:52 p.m. Pacific later today. After that deorbit burn takes place, Dragon will re-enter the Earth's atmosphere. It will deploy its drogue parachutes, followed by its main parachutes, before finally splashing down off the coast of California to fully conclude its mission. We won't be providing live coverage of that splashdown, but you can continue to follow along for updates on the International Space Station blog. And you're continuing to see a live look of the Dragon spacecraft as it continues to depart the vicinity of the International Space Station. It's now a little over 400 meters away from the space station following its undocking about 10 minutes ago. That physical separation took place at 11:05 a.m. Central, 12:05 p.m. Eastern. For those of you who are just joining us, the Dragon spacecraft for NASA's SpaceX 33rd Commercial Resupply Services mission safely undocked from the International Space Station at 11:05 a.m. Central, 12:05 p.m. Eastern, as the space station was traveling about 260 statute miles over western Argentina. Following physical separation, Dragon used its Draco thrusters to complete departure burns 0 and 1. These departure burns are carefully choreographed maneuvers that increase the distance between the spacecraft and the space station. Shortly after completing departure burn 1, Dragon exited the keep out sphere about 6 minutes ago, and Dragon is now about 520 meters away from the space station. The Keep Out Sphere is a 200-meter invisible boundary around the space station. It's one of several safety zones set up to govern visiting spacecraft either arriving or departing the space station. Before moving into the Keep Out Sphere, spacecraft have to be configured where they would not cross the imaginary boundary for at least 4 orbits, even if the spacecraft lost all maneuvering. We are now standing by for Dragon to exit the approach ellipsoid, which is another imaginary shape similar to the Keep Out Sphere, but this time a 3-dimensional ellipsoid measuring 4 by 2 by 2 kilometers. One of the key differences with the approach ellipsoid is that spacecraft outside it have to be on what we call a 24-hour safe free drift trajectory, which means the spacecraft would not cross into the approach ellipsoid for at least 24 hours, again, even if we lost all maneuvering. And we are expecting Dragon to exit the approach ellipsoid in about 6 minutes, around 11:24 a.m. Central, 12:24 p.m. Eastern. And you're continuing to see those live views of the Dragon spacecraft as it departs the vicinity of the International Space Station. It's now about 635 meters away from the space station. It undocked from the space station's Harmony module on the forward port. Currently, the space station is traveling about 260 statute miles over the South Atlantic Ocean. The individual who helps provide some of these views of these arriving and departing spacecraft is the CRONUS position here in Mission Control Houston, and CRONUS stands for Communications RF Onboard Networks Utilization Specialist, and they help manage all of the space station's computer networks and comm systems, and they also help with some of these fantastic camera views that we're able to get during these dynamic operations. As we continue to monitor Dragon's departure from the International Space Station as part of NASA's SpaceX 33rd Commercial Resupply Services mission, the Dragon, now about 740 meters away from the International Space Station, we're standing by for the exit of the approach ellipsoid, again, that 2 by 2 by 4 kilometer boundary around the space station. The Dragon spacecraft for this mission launched on Sunday, August 24th atop a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket from Space Launch Complex 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station in Florida, and the mission delivered new scientific experiments and cargo to the space station. One of those experiments was known as Microgravity-Associated Bone Loss B, or MABLE-B, which is a study of bone-forming stem cells and microgravity, which could provide insight into the basic mechanisms of the bone loss astronauts experience during long-duration spaceflight ahead of future exploration to the Moon and Mars. The Dragon spacecraft also introduced a new capability to reboost the International Space Station, helping maintain its altitude and counter atmospheric drag. During its time docked to the space station, Dragon performed 6 total reboosts. Dragon is now a little over 800 meters away from the International Space Station following that physical separation at 11:05 a.m. Central, 12:05 p.m. Eastern.
Station on 2 with an HTVX end cone stowage question.
Go ahead for HTVX.
Yeah, I was just talking with Jack and Sophie. So I think where I left some HTVX stowage a couple weeks ago was that in the end cone, I put one hardware JSB and I started putting some foam, but also currently in the end cone are the 2 doors from, I believe, the SIR rack that are in the HTVX end cone underneath the, like in the stowage locations there. Did we have a location for where those should go? Because I didn't want to finish doing the end cone stowage until we need to take I guess we need to take those doors out and put them somewhere first.
Okay, Chris, understand you've got 2 doors from the SIR rack on the end cone. We're checking to make sure we know what to do with those.
Yeah, that's a good comment. I believe they're from the SIR rack, but yeah, they're big doors with some insulation on, sound insulation on them, and they're in that end cone right now.
We copy.
And you just heard some communication there between NASA astronaut Chris Williams, who's currently aboard the International Space Station, and the CAPCOM, or Capsule Communicator, Costa Mavridis, here in the International Space Station Flight Control Room. They were discussing some of the cargo operations for the JAXA, or Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency, HTVX-1 cargo vehicle. That spacecraft is also expected to depart the International Space Station here very soon. That departure currently planned for next week on March 6th. While we've been providing this coverage of the undocking of Dragon, there have also been doing various cargo loading operations. So NASA astronaut Jack Hathaway and ESA, or European Space Agency astronaut Sophie Adano, have been working on those cargo operations alongside Chris.
Station Houston, Dragon is outside the approach ellipsoid on a 24-hour safe drift trajectory. Thanks to the SpaceX team and to the NASA team for the undock today, and thanks to you guys for all the hard work. Bon voyage to Cargo Dragon.
Station copies all. Congratulations to all the teams that made this departure possible. This was a lot of work, but it was awesome having the SpaceX 33 here, and awesome sending it back home with all chock full of science. So yeah, thanks for everything.
And we have confirmation that the Dragon spacecraft, in support of NASA's SpaceX 33rd commercial resupply services, has exited the approach ellipsoid. That means that the joint operations between the NASA and SpaceX teams have concluded, and responsibility for the spacecraft is being handed back to the SpaceX flight control team in Hawthorne, California, who will be responsible for the spacecraft for the remainder of its journey back to Earth, again with that splashdown expected early tomorrow around 1:44 a.m. Central or 11:44 p.m. Pacific off the coast of California. With that, the Dragon spacecraft for NASA's SpaceX 33rd Commercial Resupply Services mission safely departed the International Space Station today at 11:05 a.m. Central, 12:05 p.m. Eastern, as the space station was traveling 260 statute miles over western Argentina. The spacecraft crossed the approach ellipsoid just a couple of minutes ago, and joint operations between the NASA Mission Control Team here in Houston and the SpaceX Flight Control Team in Hawthorne, California concluded. The Dragon spacecraft spent about 6 months docked to the forward port of the space station's Harmony module, delivering thousands of pounds of research, hardware, and supplies to the orbiting laboratory for NASA. The spacecraft is now well on its way back to Earth, returning important scientific research samples and hardware. Splashdown is scheduled to take place around 11:44 p.m. Pacific later today, 1:44 a.m. Central, tomorrow, February 27th, off the coast of California. Splashdown won't be broadcast by NASA, but you can follow along for updates on NASA's Space Station blog at nasa.gov/blogs/spacestation. And with that, we will conclude our coverage today. Again, thank you for joining us for the departure of the Dragon spacecraft for NASA's SpaceX 33rd Commercial Resupply Services from the International Space Station. This is Mission Control Houston.